Hello everybody, it's me, Fee, or Fiona Timms, otherwise known as White Zulu, author of my autobiography of the same name, and I welcome you all to another chapter of my book. I do hope you're all enjoying my life story, and I must thank all of you for being such dedicated subscribers, especially those who have written such complimentary comments below my videos. They are much appreciated. I would like to point out that the previous South African flag hanging on the wall behind me is not a political statement. It is simply a piece of history in the background of my first 50 years of my life, being born and growing up in my beloved mother country, South Africa. My autobiography, White Zulu, is not a political commentary, and frankly describes my experiences of growing up with the Zulu tribe as my family. That flag is simply a piece of cloth signifying the history of South Africa. It was originally used by the Union of South Africa from 1928 to 1961, and later the Republic of South Africa until 1994. A first cousin of my father's had been put under house arrest for 20 consecutive years for the crime of having written a letter to our local newspaper, the Natal Witness, mildly criticizing the nationalist government. No excuse was the inevitable curt reply from the outsiders who were attacking me, and they continue to do it now. I just ignore them now. To my relief at that moment, the men came back into the drawing room, and Bar and Bob began to quarrel loudly with each other. Since it was nearly midnight, we slipped upstairs and away to the sanctuary of our bedroom. They do this every night, said Fred. I hate it, and I'd forgotten how bad they are. What? You cannot be serious. I was aghast. Every night? He nodded wearily. Yes, it's the same in Florida. I felt a lurch in my stomach, which settled into a sick chill, which had nothing to do with my morning sickness. Was this going to be for the rest of our lives? What would happen when the baby came? One of Fred's and my favourite evenings at home was to have an early bath, put on dressing gowns and slippers, and eat a supper of scrambled eggs on toast from trays on our laps. The very thought of repeating that evening's charade ad infinitum made me feel quite faint, and I sank weakly onto my side of our bed and gazed at my husband. I couldn't say anything, though. He had his obligation to Glencruitten and his mother. Since he'd inherited the estate, he had to take over the responsibility of running it. His mother had done her bit by keeping it all going while he grew up, but now the crunch had come. Fred, too, was exhausted, and after undressing and cleaning his teeth, he climbed into his side of the bed and fell asleep immediately. It felt to me that our first day at Glencruitten had been one of the longest in my life, and although I was drained with fatigue, I was so wound up that I decided to have a bath. I walked across the passage to the big bathroom and ran myself a warm bath. The tub was so big that once I was sitting in it, the water came up to my shoulders. I lay in the soft, peaty brown water, trying to relax and relieve some of the aching tension in my body. But even after I'd got out, dried myself and slipped into bed, I lay awake. The silence bothered me. There were always night noises in Africa, the comforting and constant shrill of crickets, the repetitive peep of tree frogs, the constant thump, thump, thump of the drums being beaten while our staff danced up at their huts. Then there were the barks, roars and shrieks of the baboons as a leopard tried to snatch an unwary youngster out of their sleeping tree deep in the pitch-dark bush. Wood owls called out their mournful, surprising whoo, and even the loud introductory grunts and then utterly blood-curdling shrieks of tree hyrax, dassies, which lived on the branches in the bush surrounding our farmstead, mating high in the trees, were reassuring to me. Silence was unnerving. It meant that something or someone was on the prowl outside in the dark. In towns and suburbs, fruit bats kept up a cacophony of squeaks and trills and flapping as they quarrelled vigorously over the bounty of avocados, mangoes, pawpaws and bananas that grew in the gardens. Bullfrogs croaked in ornamental ponds, forming a deep, loud bass to the many other and various types of frogs that sang in different pitches all night. But here the silence was oppressive and worrying. I lay there and tried to collect my thoughts on the day's experiences, much as one who's jumped from a plane and misjudged his landing would try to disentangle his parachute line by line from a tree. I pictured Ba living to be 90 as her mother, Grace, whose nickname was Zennie for some odd reason had, and like her mother, refusing to take a back seat. She had obviously revelled in her role as the Dowager of Glencruitten. Even Bob had admitted at dinner that he was deathly afraid of Zennie even now when she was in her 90s. She'd sat at the head of the table at every meal and held court. There should have been flashing warning lights over her self-appointed throne, Bob had said bitterly. She interfered in every matter, even our matrimonial disagreements. I sensed that there was enormous relief all over the estate when she was in Florida. Nobody missed her, least of all the staff. Pa had been running Glencruitten since Fred had been born. Now, 25 years later, she'd apparently had enough and it was time for him to take over. But would she be able to let go? I felt as though I was lying on the floor of a dank cave, chilled to the bone. I moved slightly to lie against the warm body of my husband, trying to rid myself of this feeling that my blood was congealing from an unknown fear. As I lay awake for hours that night, I decided that I didn't want to add to Fred's burden by voicing my misgivings over what our lives might become. But I could see already that I was to become as trapped as he was. Fred's great-grandfather, Alexander Mackay, bought Glencruitten House in 1917. It had been built in 1897, and Alexander had it remodelled with the addition of 2 extensions in 1905 and 1926. These were done by David Lorimer, a famous architect. Alexander's son was Ferrier Mackay, Fred's grandfather on his mother's side. Great-grandfather Alexander Mackay had Glencruitten House built when he was fairly young. He lived in London in the late 1880s was apparently very well off. He enjoyed gambling and playing with very high stakes, and had managed to win enough money to buy this enormous estate of 9,000 acres of croft land, salmon lakes, and excellent deer stalking country, as well as pheasant and grouse shooting. Apart from the existing crofts, there was no house on the land at that stage, and so he had this ostentatious baronial hall built, and he then moved up to Argyllshire to live in luxurious splendour. The house had state-of-the-art for those times, plumbing and central heating, as it was quite modern in comparison to some of the ancient, draughty old castles in the surrounding countryside, whose owners had inherited massive and often disintegrating places from their forebears. As well as Glencruitten, Alexander Mackay had also bought a huge amount of land in Florida in the USA. Included in this windfall was a substantial part of the Everglades and a large tract of land on lake frontage with park-like surroundings very near to where Disney World is built today. According to Fred, from whom I'd gleaned this history, he had also acquired an oil well or two in Texas, but apparently lost those in a gambling match. He chose his new home, La Rochelle, in Florida, from a picture in an architectural magazine. The lovely double-story house is very similar to the South Fork Ranch homestead on the Ewing Ranch in Dallas, with long wings stretching out on either side. The lawns sweep down to a big alligator-infested lake, and there is a large swimming pool and a tennis court to the left of the house. There's a huge veranda all around both ground and first floor, allowing each of the numerous bedrooms a spectacular view of the lake with its surrounding massive swamp. Swamp cypress trees, festooned with Spanish moss hanging down from every branch like long grey-green beards. Alexander intended to spend the winters in Florida's balmy tropical climate and only return to Scotland when spring was well on its way and salmon fishing would be back in season. As a lot of young, fashionable Edwardian rakes did, his only son, Ferrier, Fred's grandfather, frequented many racy nightclubs in some of the less salubrious parts of London, and there he'd seen a young performer called Grace singing in a saloon bar. He started visiting that particular dive more and more often as he'd fallen in love with the attractive singer, and eventually he asked her to marry him. Grace arrived to be lady of the manor at Glencruitten in Argyllshire and took to the position like a duck to water. In spite of having come from a very humble background as an East London waitress, she turned out to be a competent social climber, enthusiastically clawing her way into the highest ranks of the surrounding gentlefolk, and became grander and more of a snob than royalty itself. Grace, otherwise known as Zennie, had two girls, Rosemary and Elizabeth, or Bar and Weenie, as they were called. Nobody in the Mackay family seemed to have the names they were christened with, which I found odd and irritatingly confusing. It was an upper-class affectation. After her husband, Ferrier Mackay, died quite young from liver problems due to excessive alcohol consumption, Zennie, or Grace, had free rein over the place with Bar as her accomplice. It was a secret, again closely guarded by older members of the family, that great-grandfather Alexander Mackay gambled away a huge amount of his money, as well as the oil wells in Texas and all his land in the Everglades in Florida. All he had was La Rochelle, his country house in the United States, surrounded by 2,000 acres of citrus orchards, and Glencruitten in Scotland. Hard as it is to believe, for that, or possibly some other reasons, he then committed suicide, yet another dark family secret. Bar, as the elder daughter, inherited the estate to be held in trust until she bore a son. She married Peter James, Bob, and had insisted they tack the two names together. A double-barreled name sounds smarter, and she didn't have to lose the Mackay name. Weenie never married, although she had a large but undisclosed sum settled on her in a trust fund for the rest of her life. Breakfast was served in the dining room at 8 o'clock the next morning, and I dragged myself down, feeling tired and washed out. There, on the massive oak sideboard, were hot trays bearing a typical English country house breakfast, lying under ornate, polished silver-domed chafing dishes. I found oatmeal porridge, which the Scots ate with butter and salt, poached, fried and scrambled eggs, bacon, sausages, mushrooms, tomatoes, devilled kidneys, kippers, and a fish kedgeree steaming gently, and pairs of boiled eggs nestled under blue and white striped cosies. On the table itself were oatcakes, toast, and fruit. The cook excelled herself with her breakfasts, but there was a drawback, I was told. She's a dipsomaniac and cooks wonderful meals before she has a drink, and after that she'll go crazy and attack anybody who gets in her way with a carving knife. Apparently, Johnny, the gilly who had collected us from the railway station, is the only one who can approach her on those occasions. Brave man, Fred explained quietly to me as he helped himself from the spread. This feast had very little appeal for me the way I felt, and I settled for some fruit, which I ate with the tiny solid gold knife and fork which were placed alongside the delicate and almost transparent gold leaf-edged bone china fruit plates. My parents-in-law had almost finished their breakfast, and as I sat down with mine, Bob pushed his chair back from the table as he'd done the night before and lit another vile compost-smelling cigar. I swallowed the bile which rose in my throat and tried to get a few small slices of apple down. When Bar got up from her chair and told Fred to get ready for another morning tramping over their estate, he replied that we'd made other arrangements and were planning to drive into Oban. She didn't look pleased about this, but tightened her lips and said nothing. That's it for this week. I think you're beginning to get a little bit of an idea of how living with my in-laws was. And Much more to come. I must thank John Muslane for being my sound engineer, Scott, and doing an amazing job with all his tricks and everything else he's got up his sleeves to avoid being affected by load shedding. And I'll see you all next week with some more about living at Glencruitten in a castle. Bye-bye. That is all for the time being, and there's more to come next week. I would like to thank John Muslane for putting aside his Friday afternoons to help me produce these videos. Without him, I could not do this. I would also like to thank Sean van Vuren for his sterling work in uploading my videos to my YouTube channel, adding the photos, as well as managing my channel so professionally. If you would like to know more about my other works, I have written 5 books in all, and each one is autobiographical. Please visit my website at www.whitezulubook.com, where you will find a lot more information as well as plenty of photographs. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed my life story, and there is plenty more to come. A thumbnail photo will be attached each week, and thank you so much for all your support and all the very kind remarks you make in complimenting me on my work. I really appreciate it. Goodbye.